201?
No, this is 202. 8564 regarding the petition of GMP Solar Richmond LLC for a certificate of public good pursuant to 30 VSA 248, authorizing the installation and operation of a 2.0 megawatt solar electric generation facility in Richmond, Vermont, to be known as the GMP Solar Richmond project. My name is Lynn Fabrizio. I'm the hearing officer for this case. And before we went on the record, we had a short discussion of preliminary issues with the parties. And so I'd like to start by I'll start by taking appearances before we get going.
Jeannie Oliver for the Department of Public Service, and with me is the department's witness, Sean Foley, who is the Acting Director of Finance and Economics.
Evan Meaden for the Agency of Natural Resources.
Jeff Hand from Dunhill Saunders on behalf of the petitioner and GMP. With me is Vic Westgate from our office. And I have witnesses Kirk Shields, Rod Viens, Doug Smith, and Pam Allen with me, as well as Lincoln Landy from Pro Solar. I'd also just like to note for the record that we are very proud to be the first hearing on the Susan M. Hudson hearing.
Thank you. Okay, it's two preliminary matters. Ms. Oliver?
Yes, so on the 25th of November 2015, the department issued a Section 202F letter for this project. In the second paragraph, it states that it has a sentence that contains the expression terms of issue. We just want to clarify that means the term of issuance of the CEG.
Great, thank you.
And then one other preliminary matter from us, it's come to our attention. We filed a notice of appearance for GMP, but not an actual motion or beans. We'd like to make an oral motion to intervene on behalf of GMP.
Are there any objections?
No.
And I hereby grant the intervention under Board Rule 2.209B.
Thank you.
And would you like to proceed with exhibit?
Sure. I think what I'd like to do, acceptable, we'll start with the witnesses that will be submitting via stipulation with an affidavit, get those into the record, and then call up the witnesses. So we've prepared and have marked for admission the final exhibit list, which we've labeled GRP-1. I'll just give this to the hearing officer. All right, and I'm going to start on the second page. Actually, excuse me, on the first page at the bottom, with the pre-filed direct testimony of Mark Kane, dated 7/2015, and with that exhibits MK1 through MK4. Next, we'd like to move to admit the pre-filed direct testimony of Ian Jukes, dated 7/2015, with exhibits IJ1 through IJ3. Next, the pre-filed direct testimony of Dory Barton, dated 7/2015, with exhibits DB1 through DB2. And then the pre-filed direct testimony of Charles Knight, dated 7/2015, with exhibits CK1 and CK2. And then finally, we have the stipulations with the department and the agency. First is GRP-ANR1, which is a stipulation between the petitioner and the Agency of Natural Resources, and GRP-PSD1, which is the stipulation between the petitioner, Green Mountain Power, and the Department of Public Service. It has to move the admission of all those pieces of testimony.
Are there any objections?
No.
So moved. Exhibits are admitted.
Okay, I think we'd like to start with Mr. Rod Viens. While he's getting situated, we provided affidavits for the witnesses who are not appearing here today. Just want to make clear whether the hearing officer would like those affidavits to be filed with the pre-filed testimony as part of the record, so that the court reporter has that.
Yes. Thank you. Do you have that with you?
They are with the excuse me, with the final copies for the record, the affidavits.
Okay.
Yes.
And when will you move to objections to the admission of the affidavits?
No.
Thank you.
Mr. Reed, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Good morning, Mr. Dean.
Good morning.
So we're just going to get your testimony into the record, and then I understand you have one supplemental exhibit. Let's start. First, you prepared pre-filed direct testimony on 7/20/15 with exhibits RV1 through RV5. Do you have any changes to make to that testimony?
No, I don't.
And you also prepared supplemental pre-filed direct testimony on 11/20/15 with exhibit RV6. Do you have any changes to make to that testimony?
No, I don't.
And I understand we first move to admit those exhibits to testimony.
Any objections?
No.
So admitted? Thank you.
And I understand that you have a supplemental exhibit to provide to the board today. Can you, and that's been marked as RV2 revised. Can you please identify what that exhibit is?
Sure, it's exhibit GRP RV2,
And that's a revised site plan?
revised site plan, correct.
Can you identify the changes that were made in the revision?
Sure. All the changes we made in this site plan are all within the original fence line and within the original project envelope. We have moved a few racks around. We've adjusted their locations. We have adjusted the tilt angle of the panels from 15 degrees to 20 degrees. We have adjusted where the transformers are located to provide more efficiency with the conductoring. In addition, we added one equipment pad to the southerly transformer area that was mistakenly omitted originally. And within the racking changes, we actually pulled some racks out of the wetlands buffer due to avoidance of shading.
Are there any other changes?
No.
And did the petitioner share that revision with the agency and the department?
Yes, we did.
We'd like to move the admission of that exhibit as well. Both the department and the agency, I understand, don't have any questions or concerns regarding the revisions.
You have no concerns? Questions, Sam?
We reviewed the changes and we have no concerns from an engineering or aesthetics perspective.
Okay.
The agency doesn't have any concerns either. We compared the changes on the updated site plan to what was within the wetlands permit that was issued for this project, and everything is consistent with what has already been permitted. So there's no concerns with the updates.
Thank you. Those are admitted.
I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you.
Unless you have any questions.
Just what prompted the changes to the tilt?
This is when we go to what's called 50% design review. We take another look at the entire layout and see where we can create some efficiencies for the project and maybe gain some production and go into a 20-degree tilt, allow the project to see a bit more production.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next witness will be Kirk Shields.
Mr. Shields,
Good morning.
do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Good morning, Mr. Shields.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good.
Get your testimony in the record, and then I understand you have a couple of updates to provide the board. First, you prepared and filed pre-filed direct testimony dated 7/20/15 with exhibit KWS1. Do you have any changes to make to that testimony?
No corrections to make.
And then you also prepared supplemental pre-filed direct testimony dated 9/11/15. And with that, you filed one exhibit, KWS4. Do you have any corrections to make to that?
No.
Okay. Just so the record's clear, there actually is no exhibit KSW2 or KSW3. We verbally skipped those numbers. So I think we'd like to move the admission of those pieces of testimony in the exhibit. Please. Okay.
Any objections?
No.
No.
So admitted. Thanks.
Mr. Shields, I understand that you have a couple of updates to provide the board. What are those updates?
So I have two updates. The investment tax credit has been extended beyond beyond the end of 2016. We do have commitments with the contractor, with our tax equity partner, though, to stay on track with our current schedule. The second update is that at the time I submitted testimony, we had not yet identified a tax equity partner. We're still negotiating with several potential partners, but we have selected U.S. Bank as our tax equity partner.
Yes.
And then I understand you have a supplemental exhibit that was filed yesterday that is KWS 5, which is a form letter of credit. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I'd like to move the admission of that exhibit, understanding that we had some exchange before going on the record, that we will be filing a corrected version of that after discussing.
Okay, and to clarify, that preliminary discussion entailed language on.
Yes, I believe it's on the second page. There's a parenthetical related to obligations of the applicant. It's not clear in the language who the "you" refers to. My understanding is that although the board has approved letters of credit with that parenthetical, they have requested that that be struck.
That being the parenthetical language from the second to last paragraph on page 2 of the form letter.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any objections?
No.
So admitted. Thank you.
Witnesses available for questions?
So I think you're going to hear some familiar questions because the testimonies in the two cases that appeared for this week are fairly similar. And these are for clarification of the record and our understanding of the project mechanics. So looking first at your September 11th pre-file testimony. On page 2 of that testimony. You refer to a 60-40 initial investment split between GMP and the tax equity partners. That's still inaccurate?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And you state that GMP Solar will flow power purchase agreement proceeds back to GMP and the tax equity investor based on the 60-40 ownership share. That's on page lines 17 through 19. And then you state a little further down that the costs and proceeds of the PPA are allocated 99% to the tax investor and 1% to GMP. Could you please clarify those two statements read together?
Sure. So the capital investment made by GMP and the tax equity investor are, as the 60-40 split explains. I should clarify, though, as you point out, the way the tax investor draws its benefits back and earns a return on its investment is primarily through the tax benefits and depreciation and some cash. So initially, the tax equity investor will have rights to 99% of the investment tax credit and the depreciation, and GMP will have 1% of those benefits, and then the cash flow will be split differently. So the tax equity investor will earn a small amount of the cash. GMP, the project company, will flow back to GMP the majority of the cash, and then the tax investor will have a few percent that's left over that will flow to the tax investor.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And your testimony also suggests that GMP intends to place its capital investment into rate base, and that's approximately 60% of the project cost?
Yes.
Town investment?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. And during the first 5 years of the partnership agreement, GMP will be entitled to very little in the way of depreciation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so will the capital costs booked into rate base remain close to constant for that 5-year period as a result?
Yes, there won't be any changes to what goes into rate base. It would just be based on GMP's 60% investment.
And when GMP elects to exercise its option to buy out the tax equity partner after 5 years, will GMP put the remaining capital investment into rate base at that point?
No, the undepreciated project will still have, will still be based on its original 60% investment, so it won't be inflated by the investment, by the portion that the tax investor owns. There's a small portion, I think it's a couple $100,000 at the buyout. That's the only piece that could make the amount that's rate-based increase. But otherwise, it's based on the original 60%.
And that small amount represents an already depreciated portion, is that?
That reflects the, after the 5th year, GMP has 95% of the project benefits flowing to it, and the tax equity investor has achieved most of its return through tax benefits already. So their remaining share in the project is only 5%. So the buyout is basically a fair market value or discounted cash flow valuation of the remaining cash flow for that 5% over the remainder of the project. So that's the part that we would buy out the tax equity investor.
Okay, great. And with respect to costs, in calculating the levelized cost of the project, did you include a budget item for the system impact and facility studies?
Yes, we did. It was all included in the interconnection budget.
And were the cost of any upgrades identified in those studies, or included in your calculations, I should say?
Yes, we budgeted for expected upgrades and the studies together.
Okay. Shall we defer to Ms. Allen for update on the studies?
Correct.
Okay. And Mr. Shields, are your assumptions in calculating the levelized cost consistent with what the studies are showing at this point?
Yes, we don't have any updated information that would change the original estimates.
Okay. And the interconnection cost will also be split 60-40 between GMP and the tax equity partner?
As part of the capital cost, yes, those costs will be shared the same way.
And what are the consequences if interconnection costs are higher than expected?
Sure, it can change the project economics. We don't expect there will be significant differences that would change it, but we would probably have to reevaluate if we had a significant change in interconnection costs.
And you would know that once the studies are submitted, is that correct?
Right.
All right, I think that's all I have for questions. Are there any follow-up?
No. No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next we'd like to call Mr. Glenn Smith to stand.
Morning, Mr. Smith.
Good morning.
Do you swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury, excuse me, that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Smith.
Good morning.
I just want to get your testimony into the record. You pre-filed direct testimony on 7/20/15 with exhibits TCS 1 through 4. Do you have any corrections to make to that testimony?
No corrections to make, subject to the fact that I did file a later supplemental testimony which replaced one of those exhibits, number 3, I believe.
Yes. So you had a first supplemental testimony that we filed on 11/20/15 with exhibit DCS 3 revised. Any changes to make to that supplemental testimony?
No.
Okay. And then yesterday we filed a second supplemental pre-filed direct testimony with no exhibits that was dated 1/7/16. Do you have any corrections or changes to make to that testimony?
No.
With that, we move the admission of all 3 pieces of testimony and accompanying exhibits.
Any objections? No.
No.
So admitted.
If the witness is available.
So, let's see, looking at your November 20th testimony, and on page 2, lines 17 to 19, you state that you've updated your estimate of the value of the project's output to reflect more current, lower expectations for future energy and capacity market prices. Whose expectations are you referring to there?
I'm referring specifically to Green Mountain Power, but I think that the, particularly with respect to the energy market, the developments in 2015 in terms of lower fossil fuel prices, at least on a short-term basis, and lower transparent market prices, such as NYMEX futures contracts or other indications, mean that while the specific numbers are Green Mountain Power's, they're very consistent with recent market indications and with the Public Service Department's update of its PERPA avoided cost estimates around that same time frame in the fall of 2015.
Okay, great, thank you. And let's see. Similarly, on pages 2 to 3 of the same testimony, you state that you've lowered the assumed long-term escalation of regional network service transmission rates from 3% a year to 2%. What is the basis for your revised assumption?
I guess the short story is that in looking at the investment pattern and escalation rate historically of bulk transmission plant in service by the transmission owners in New England. This is the transmission plant that drives basically the regional network service rate. That has been growing for a number of years at a rate well above inflation. But we are seeing anecdotal evidence that the pace of those mostly reliability-driven projects appears to be slowing. That's a significant consideration. And the other one was the notion that if the region during this decade has put into service or will something on the order of $10 billion of bulk transmission plant in service, the depreciation over time of that transmission plant, the fact that it's such a large number and will begin to depreciate in these rate-making calculations that drive the RNS, will put a downward pressure, all else equal, on the rate of growth. So those were the two primary considerations I used to assume that after the current 4 or 5 year forecast period that those rates would not grow as rapidly. And
is it safe to say that your assessment is based in part on ISO New England forecast of transmission, and does it take into account transmission projects that are in ISO's queue at this point?
Okay. The forecasted RNS value in my testimony does reflect ISO New England forecast, but only for a discrete period. I think it's 5 years. So the escalation rate I was just referring to is sort of the answer to the question, what then? When the roster of reliability-driven projects is not really scoped out to a degree, at least to my knowledge, to support an ISO forecast. So it's 5 years based on an ISO forecast, and thereafter a judgment based on primarily on the factors that I mentioned.
And would your assumptions change if you took into account the non-reliability projects?
I'm referring categorically to all the projects that compose so-called PTF transmission facilities and that drive the regional network service rate. I probably was a little loose in my terminology, but my point was that those large increases, those major expenditures, have been driven overwhelmingly in this decade by reliability-driven considerations, contingency analyses that showed unacceptable outcomes with the current plant in service. And I should add, just for context, one reason that we did not assume a lower rate, like 1% or even flat over time, was the fact that my colleagues and I recognize that reliability projects are not the only ones that drive bulk transmission investment, and the management and replacement of the fleet of transmission plant, conductor, transformers, and so forth will drive some amount of additional investment, even if peak demand in the region is flat and those contingency analyses don't show as many reliability needs as they used to.
Great, and just for the clarification on the record, could you define PTF?
By PTF, I mean pool transmission facility projects.
Great, thank you. See, so in same testimony, with respect to a revised estimate of the assumed value of Project REX, renewable energy credits, for the record, you cite the potential that such RECs may not remain eligible for regional Class 1 RPS programs after they have operated for many years. Could you explain that statement, just for clarity's sake?
Yes. The regional Class 1 REC market that we're describing here refers to states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And each state's definitions of its renewable power goals are a little bit different, but what's common is that some technologies like solar and wind are eligible, so like the project here, but they have different vintage dates. That is, to qualify for Class 1, a project must have been built or refurbished after some defined date. Those differ by state, but the concept I'm referring to here is that I think it would be a little bit optimistic to assume that projects that are built today would remain eligible forever as a Class 1 or new renewable resource in these neighboring states. Their RPS programs have not been around yet for 20 or 30 years, so states haven't really had the need to fully address this policy question. But what I'm basically assuming here is that after 20 years, it's a judgment-based estimate, but after 20 years, the neighboring states will assign less value to a set of renewable plants that is of that age. That is, at some point, whether it be 20 or 30 years, somewhere in there, it makes sense that the neighboring states probably would treat projects like this as eligible, as renewable, but maybe not for their premium, highest value category of RECs.
Great, thank you, that's helpful. Okay, now I'd like to move to the testimony that you filed last night, January 7th, the second supplemental.
Okay.
Here it was, I really wanted to hear from you just sort of an elaboration to clarify your discussion regarding your revised assumptions for the potential regional network service rates in this context.
Sure. There were two concepts I was referring to in this testimony. The primary one is if the output of this project, if this project goes forward, to what extent can it reduce RNS or regional network service transmission charges? And that's primarily a function for a plant that will operate like this one in a load reducer mode, as opposed to a registered ISO generator in the capacity and energy market. For a plant like this, a key driver is to what extent will the output of the project be coincident with the monthly transmission system peak loads that drive our RNS charges. And the revision I described can basically be summarized as an observation that in the last several years, Vermont's monthly system peaks, the one that drive those transmission charges, appear to be shifting toward the later afternoon and into the evening. And what that means for a future solar project investment like this one is that if Vermont's peak in a certain month is in an evening hour or a late afternoon one, where the project's output based on sunlight tends to be not as high as in the middle of the day, the incremental value in terms of displacing regional network service charges is lower. So that's the primary change I was describing. Maybe I should stop there and see if I've covered that enough before I hit the second topic.
It's just interesting. Do you have any idea what's behind that shift in peak load? Because it leads to a fairly significant recalculation.
Well, it's a good question, and you're right. One of the things that has and does make solar power special and make it cost effective to deploy solar at a price that's over 10 cents a kilowatt hour is this valuable shape and the ability to reduce some of our peaks that drive different types of costs. So it's a good question. What's driving it? Any one year, the timing of the peak can be subject to short-term fluctuations like weather on a particular peak day, how extreme the summer weather was, for example, things like that. But to my mind, one of the top drivers is in fact of the peak shifting in Vermont is in fact the deployment of distributed solar in Vermont. Net metering, that served to reduce the amount of power that our customers require from GMP during the sunny hours, and therefore Green Mountain Power's requirements from ISO New England in those hours. Standard offer program, same thing. We have tens of megawatts of solar now, which is deployed as load reducers as well. So their output tends to reduce. Green Mountain Power and other utilities draw from ISO New England during the hours where there's sunlight. So I see that as, if not, maybe not the entire factor, probably the dominant one in driving the shift in the timing of the peak loads that we're observing.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful.
I may have. There were two aspects of the regional network service in my in the question you were referring to. I didn't hit the second one. I'm not sure if your primary. Let me know if I should address the second topic.
Distributed generation?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay. So the second factor I was referring to is simply that. So the dynamic I just described, that distributed generation, either behind the customer's meter or on Green Mountain Power's distribution system, reduces the amount of power we need from ISO New England, that's pretty well understood. What I'm referring to in this recent supplemental testimony is simply the notion that at a recent gathering of Vermont, I guess I'll say stakeholders, some utility personnel, Velco, other Vermont System Planning Committee members, at a conversation that was convened to discuss qualifying facilities, such as the Ranger solar projects, and how they would interface with the wholesale electric market and the interconnection procedures. Some folks at that meeting expressed uncertainty as to whether the current practice of having distributed load reducers like this project would be reducing our transmission charges is the correct one. They basically raised a tariff, an ISO New England open access transmission tariff question. And so what I'm doing in these couple of paragraphs is alerting to the board here that while I think I have it right and that distributed generation of this type does and should be assumed if it's producing at the time of certain peaks to reduce transmission charges, that a question came up in this stakeholder discussion, and it didn't sound to me like it was totally resolved based on, I had a couple of conversations with folks who were at that meeting, and I looked at some notes, and I was encouraged, I think properly, when discussing this with the Public Service Department staff, I was encouraged that it would be better to raise this as an issue now, since regional network service charges is one of the value sources for distributed solar, even if the way I'm doing it is sort of in the awkward stage of we have an issue that we need to research and nail down, and right today it is not fully resolved. So I'm that section of my supplemental testimony simply raises the issue and notes that it's something that Green Mountain Power and other stakeholders will need to address. But even if it turns out that these regional network service charges are not avoidable ultimately by this project, its relative cost competitiveness and its fit with the statutory criteria, need, economic benefit, and the planning related ones, in my view, is still sound.
Thank you. And on that note, can I ask the department, does the department support the testimony that was filed yesterday?
Yes.
Mr. Smith, thank you. Now, I'd actually like to go back to your original pre-file testimony. Just I think, quick clarifications of some of the statements that you've made. I'm going first to page 15.
I'm there.
Okay, great. Lines 9 to 10, you refer to solar as, let's see, the project is one of the lowest cost sources of new solar power presently available to GMP. Could you elaborate on that statement?
Sure. The passage you just referred to is a summary of what's explained in more depth later in the testimony. But basically what I mean by that is if we look at solar sources that have been solicited in the last year or two, either by Green Mountain Power directly or by the speed facilitator through the standard offer program in Vermont, that the price of power for the project appears toward the low end of that group. And as I explain in, well, I forget which page it's at, but that conclusion is based on two parts. One is the estimated price of power or cost of power over 25 years, 12.9 cents a kilowatt hour, levelized, no escalation. And the second part is that at the end of that 25 years, Green Mountain Power will own the facility. And at that point, we will have a resource that's valuable for customers, either through repowering the project or if it continues to operate past 25 years.
Great, thank you.
So that's the high level. I could go into more numbers, but
No.
that's the comparison I'm referring to.
I was looking for the relative to what, and you've answered that, so thank you. On lines 11 to 12, the same page, you refer to the relatively valuable output profile of solar power. Another statement that I'd like you to elaborate on.
Sure. The short story there is simply that it's on-peak power primarily. It's daytime hours. So on average, the locational marginal prices or energy market prices in New England are higher than a simple average over the year during the hours when the solar produces. And then the other considerations are the ones I referred to related to the fact that solar output tends to be during some hours when Green Mountain Power faces peak-related charges, like the R&S ones we discussed, as well as regional capacity charges in the forward capacity market. that get allocated based on, to load servers like us, they get allocated based on our share of system load during the single peak hour of the year in the ISO New England market, and that tends to be during hot summer afternoons when the production from solar projects is solid. There are some secondary considerations that I don't spend as many words in the testimony on, but they refer to the fact that in some circuits, Rutland has been an example where there are reliability-driven needs to invest in distribution or transmission equipment. In some places like that, additional solar power can defer that need for either distribution investment or VELCO or bulk transmission system investment in some places.
Thank you. Let's see, the same page, 15, line 20, you refer to significant payment streams where you refer to state and local tax payments. Given your more recent testimony on your revised tax estimates, would you change the characterization of significant? I'm sorry, would you change the characterization of the word in the word significant? It's page 15, line 20.
I need to take a moment to check that. The passage that we're referring to there is on the top of page 22 in my direct testimony, and is referring to about $8,000 per year of state education tax and another $22,000 roughly of municipal property taxes.
And you revised that muni tax figure in later testimony, I believe. Is that?
I think it was corrected through Mr. Vien's.
Okay.
I'm happy to show him Mr. Vien's testimony where he makes the correction, and then we can refer to that if you have questions.
Okay, thank you.
That's the help I was going to ask for. Thank you. So the revision that you correctly pointed me to was from $22,000 for municipal property tax to a revised estimate of about $18,000. That magnitude of change doesn't change the point I was making, only the magnitude a little bit. The point remaining that this is a stream of payments to Vermont entities that would not occur if, for example, Green Mountain Power bought the equivalent amount of power from the ISO market and purchased renewable energy certificates from some out-of-state entity. We wouldn't get these value streams. So it's a little bit lower, but the concept and the similar magnitude apply.
Great, thanks. That's exactly what I was looking for.
And just so the record's clear, Mr. Smith was referring to page 2 of Mr. Vien's November 20th, 2015 testimony, supplemental testimony.
Thanks. And I think a very related question, and it's my last one for you, Mr. Smith. Line 21, again, this is on page 15, you refer to economic activity that would not occur if GMP were to purchase alternative power from out-of-state sources. And could you just identify the economic activity you're referring to in that statement, please?
That has to do with the planning, permitting, construction, and operation and maintenance of the facility. Now, some of those categories I referred to are fairly small in magnitude, but the point is that I did not attempt to quantify those or rely on them in the benefit cost quantitative portion of my testimony, and they amount to something, even if in this consideration of the statutory criteria for economic benefit, even if we didn't quantify them.
Thank you. So. And that's all I have for Mr. Smith. Are there any follow-up questions?
The department just has one follow-up question. Mr. Smith, this relates to the testimony that you filed yesterday. And I just want to see if you can clarify for us the impact the RNS value has on lease cost analysis. So, how does the regional network services value for this project affect the value of the project in terms of GMP's renewable energy standard tier 2 requirements, if at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in short, my supplemental testimony you're referring to refers to the notion that according to our more updated estimates, the value in terms of reduced transmission expenses that GMP can achieve from the output of this project declines from my original testimony of about 2 cents per kilowatt hour to a little less than 1 cent per kilowatt hour in the revised analysis. So essentially, a shorthand way to think about it could be that all else equal, this dynamic we just discussed, the peak shifting and the value in terms of transmission expense reduction, is that looking forward, distributed solar of this type provides a little bit less value of output and effectively represents a little bit more costly compliance option going forward for Tier 2 than say the first 50 or 100 megawatts of solar in Vermont would have.
So just to be sure, even if the value of the RMS was very small, this would still be the least cost option for GMP?
Yes, it would. And while there could be individual projects, credibly, from other technologies that could, I believe, appear and compete or maybe in some cases be modestly lower in terms of net cost. My earlier testimony describes the notion that we're talking about a magnitude probably of several hundred megawatts in the next 10 to 15 years for Tier 2. And while individual projects, perhaps landfill gas or a hydroelectric upgrade, things like this, could turn out to be cheaper, what I'm basically saying is that to comply with magnitudes of distributed renewable requirements of this type, there is not a source available on a large scale that is likely to come in more cost effectively when you consider the cost of the power and the value that you've been asking me about in terms of power and transmission costs.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're excused.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I believe our last witness is Pam Allen.
Okay. Morning, Ms. Allen. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So we just want to get your testimony into the record. You filed in this case pre-filed direct testimony dated 7/20/15 with exhibits PA 1 through 3. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections or clarifications to make to that testimony?
Yes.
What are those clarifications?
Yeah.
Just wait just 1 moment to hear an answer. Go ahead.
All right.
Page 3, line 7. The date there is April 7th. It should be April 2nd.
Okay, next correction.
Page 3, line 14. The amount should be 38.13 kilowatts, not 83.3.
Okay. And then the final correction.
Page 4, line 5. The amount on that line should be 2,533.2 instead of 2,554.
And just to be clear,
Or-
it's written, it's expressed in megawatts.
Right.
now, so it should be 2.5332 instead of 2.554.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Any other corrections to make?
Nope.
With that, we'd like to move the addition of testimony and exhibits.
Any objections?
No.
So recommended. And I just had a follow-up question on the status of the system impact and facility studies. The system impact, sorry, when do you expect those to be available? The system impact study we expect to be available by the end of January at the latest. And the facility study should follow the timeline in the Rule 5.500. Thanks. All right. Thank you.
So that is all the petitioner's evidence.
Thank you.
The department has a witness, Sean Foley, who would like to invite up to the stand.
Morning, Mr.
Morning.
Foley. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning. Can you please state your name and where you're employed?
Yes, my name's Sean Foley. I'm the Acting Director of Finance and Economics for the Vermont Department of Public Service.
And did you prepare the pre-filed testimony dated November 25th, 2015, entitled Pre-filed Testimony of Sean A. Foley?
Yes, I did.
Was your pre-filed testimony based on your personal knowledge?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections to your testimony today?
No, I do not.
If I were to ask you the same questions, would you get the same answers?
Yes, I would.
I move for the admission of Mr. Foley's pre-filed testimony.
Any objections?
No.
Mr. Foley is available to question.
Thank you. Mr. Foley, I just have a couple of questions for clarification of your testimony so that I understand where you're coming from. On page 2 of the November 25th testimony, you refer in lines 6 through 9 to research on photovoltaic historical performance based on literature reviews and interviews with NREL experts. Whose research is that referring to?
NRELs.
Okay, and that is something that you have read?
Yes.
yourself, but it wasn't you interviewing NREL
No.
experts, okay. All right. And on page 3, you discuss GMP's reassessment of the estimated depreciable life of the project facility.
Yes.
And based on your understanding of the MOU that the department has signed with GMP and GMP Solar, will the department be free to advocate for a longer depreciable life for the capitalized costs of the project in a future rate proceeding, even if petitioner and GMP do not agree with the department?
That's correct.
Great, thank you. And if we have had a statement from Ms. Oliver, but do you support the revised assumptions that Mr. Smith has made with respect to regional network service transmission charge savings?
Yes, and I'd like to add, Green Mountain Power has a Tier 2 requirement, and most of these Tier 2 requirements would also be subject to these evaluations of RNS. And this project does represent Green Mountain Power's a least cost opportunity for Green Mountain Power to meet their Tier 2 requirements. And even if RNS was valued at 0, that this would still represent a least cost opportunity for Green Mountain Power to meet their RNS requirements. Their RES requirements, which is a regional energy, renewable energy standard.
Great. Thank you. That's very helpful. And that's all I have for you today. Are there any follow-up questions for Mr. Hannaford?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Did you move for the admission? Did you move for the admission of his testimony? Ms. Hollins?
I don't remember, but I moved for the admission of Mr. Foley's testimony.
Any objections?
No.
So admitted. Okay, we had one other preliminary discussion item earlier that I'd like to just address today. The board received a letter from the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission in support of the project. And I'd like to admit that as Board 1, Exhibit Board 1. Are there any objections to the admission?
No.
No.
Thank you. Okay, I think that concludes our agenda for today. Are there any other issues that the parties would like to raise at this point?
I think just to put on the record that the parties have discussed filing revised proposed findings in order, and we would wait to do that in the next 10 days.
Great, thank you. And what is essentially a record request and a letter of credit will come in at the same time?
Yes.
I can expect that, okay. That's it? So with nothing further, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.